Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch to this session on multilateralism, nationalism, and the future of international order. If that doesn't wake you up after lunch, nothing will. We are going to try out a new format for this year's Bruegel annual meetings, something we're calling a cross interview, in which my colleague, Professor André Sapir, and I will cross-examine our two very distinguished speakers on this tricky issue. So we have here two gentlemen who know the multilateral system incredibly well and have indeed contributed to it in both academic research and practice. We have Professor Gérard Roland, who's the E. Maurice Cox Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and also well known to those of us in Belgium as a former professor of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He's just published a recent book on the whole question of how can democracies, nation states, and empires coexist, the inherent tensions between them, and problems like the tendency of democracies to appease rather than to go to war, which can be a difficult position to be in a very realist world. So he's going to talk to us about the ideas from his book, which you can also, of course, see online. And we will then have comments and analysis from Pascal Lamy, very well known in Brussels, from his time as the Trade Commissioner of the European Union, and then, of course, as Director General of the World Trade Organization for 2 terms. And Pascal is now, as you can see on the screen, Vice President of the Paris Peace Forum. He's also coordinator of the Institut Jacques Delors in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. So he will draw on his extensive practical experience. So today, the predominant photo that you can see in most major newspapers is a photograph of the largest military parade ever in Beijing, where the guests of honor to watch the military parade are the President of Russia, the great leader of North Korea, and in the photos you can also see Lukashenko and others. This is a world of where might is right is becoming a predominant way of thinking, and one of geopolitics where it's very difficult for the European Union to continue to ensure the very favorable conditions that have led to such great prosperity on our continent, which have supported the European project, the single market, the formation of the euro, and other achievements. When trade was based largely on rules rather than on power, and where European governments had outsized roles in multilateral institutions, we felt pretty comfortable in the world, especially where we could rely on the US as a strong ally that mostly worked with Europe to deter military expansionism and to maintain international law, human rights, and open markets. So as these previously favorable conditions deteriorate, we're definitely using out. The EU is an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm, in the inimitable words of a German. And this is a situation which it's rather hard for us to change rapidly. As we heard in the previous sessions today, we're very far from having defense capabilities that we would need to be able to cope without the United States. And we also have a tendency to prefer multilateralism for other reasons too. European integration was always intended to be an inherently multilateral project, one that maintained national sovereignty but overcame the ideology of nationalism. And as nationalism, particularly nationalist populism, rises as a political force in Europe, encouraged by certain hostile powers, this is also a threat from within the European Union as a multilateral project. So we're going to talk today about what to do as the post-war multilateral project fragments, what new forms of cooperation, including coalitions of the willing, as just discussed before lunch, might replace it or certainly complement it, whether the rise of nation-first international politics will continue, and what are the long-term implications of that for peace and prosperity, and whether it's possible for Europe to lead new coalitions of the willing to ensure cooperation on trade, on climate, between smaller groups of countries, and whether it's possible for us to oppose the Trump administration openly. Our leaders have been pretty cautious about doing that so far, but at what point might that be necessary or even possible, and would that help multilateralism? So we'll hear two intellectual approaches to these questions. You can think about your own questions. I'll come to those after we've had two presentations and a few questions in the cross-interview here on the stage. And those of you online can ask your questions on Slido under the hashtag multilateralism. So not multilateral, but multilateralism. That's the hashtag on Slido. And I'll be able to receive those here. So first of all, Gérard, tell us about this world of nation-states, democracies, and empires.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'm very honored to be here. I'm very admirative of the policy work that Bruegel has done the last 20 years, and I'm really glad to be here. So I was asked to explain in like 10 minutes some of the main ideas in my forthcoming book at Princeton University Press, and so I'll start right away. So essentially, I'm looking at institutions in the international arena, and I'm looking at three kind of ideal types of institutional regimes and that matter for international relations: empires, nation-states, and democracies. When I talk about empires, that's basically in terms of conflict, last thousands of years. That's what we've seen for most of history until roughly the mid-19th century. Starting from the mid-19th century, empires have started to decline in number and also in their the share of land that they own. And so actually in international relations, you have the so-called realist school, John Mearsheimer being one of the most famous right now, and actually a lot of the logic of what they're looking at is really based on interactions between empires. Then you have nation-states, and nation-states mostly grew out of emancipation from empires, so those were smaller territories with particular ethnic groups that were very often discriminated against in empires, and so they liberated themselves from empires. And when I talk about nation-states, certainly today, I mean the project of a nation-state, which is shared, in many countries. This is to have an ethnically homogeneous population within the boundaries of the country. And so immediately what comes to mind is Hungary. Hungary would be today's example of a nation-state, but it's also the ideal that you have in Poland among the PIS party. They have exactly the same project. You could say the same about Israel today, certainly, and a lot of the extreme right in Europe is fostering this nation-state project. Now, democracies is very, very different. Very often democracies grew out of nation-states, but of course it's a different regime. And so if we kind of compare, very quickly characteristics of empires, nation-states, and democracies, empires in general tend to be autocratic regimes. They have an inherent tendency towards expansionism. It can take different forms, but they are clearly expansionist. Think about Russia today. Nation-states, in contrast, are not expansionist the way empires are. Essentially, they want the boundaries of the country to correspond essentially to the kind of ethnic group. So if you think of Hungary, they would probably like to have part of Slovakia, part of Romania, so that it could be a ethnically homogeneous country. Democracies, on the other hand, have the opposite tendency. They have a tendency towards secession. and there's been a lot of research on that. I've done some research. Alberto Alesina and other people have done work on that, and so that is an inherent characteristic of democracies, which of course very different from empires. Empires tend to be multi-ethnic. Same with democracies, nation-state mono-ethnic. The ideology corresponds, so empires had universalist ideologies like the great religions, etc. A religion of nation-states is nationalism, and democracies have universalist ideology emphasizing freedom and human rights. There's also a difference in public spending favored, sources of growth are also different. Openness to trade, very, very different, which is much weaker in nation states. Openness to immigration, big contrast there between democracies and nation states. Same thing with openness to FDI. When it comes to domestic defense capacity, in general, both nation states and democracy have a pretty good ability at defending themselves because, you know, whether it's democracy, people want to defend their freedom, but, you know, even in a nation state where basically the population is included, so they want to fight to keep their national sovereignty. In terms of defense solidarity with other countries, this varies, but I want to mention here one thing that is the tendency of democracies towards appeasement. Now, when we look at the lessons from the 1930s, we think, oh, those were really policy mistakes. You know, Daladier, Chamberlain, you know, they shouldn't have appeased. But if you look a little bit, you know, at also what's happening today, we see tendencies towards appeasement. And this is not something that is kind of, you know, policy that would be wrong. It's a structural tendency of democracies because, you know, politicians are accountable to their population, and they, you know, in the case of 1930s, in France they said, you know, we don't want to die for Danzig, you know, that was the slogan, and many people today say, you know, why should we care about Ukraine? And so there is this tendency towards appeasement that I think is a weakness of democracies. Finally, in terms of vulnerability to secessions, this can be variable. Let me just mention one thing about democracies, is that even though they do have a tendency towards secessionism, they can be flexible by finding forms of federalism or decentralization that kind of you know, help to deal with it. So just two things I want, you know, us to keep from this is that democracies do have a tendency towards fragmentation. It's structural, it's institutional, so it's something that one has to deal with, and they have a tendency towards appeasement. And so in terms of international relations, those things really matter. Now, again, to be very, very quickly, and you know, I'm an academic, so I'm not looking at the next 6 months. I'm really looking at low-frequency events, at, you know, long-run history. And so, very quickly, I would claim that in the modern world, empires are doomed. We still have empires today. You know, Russia, very active. China is very active. By the way, I should mention the US. So these were ideal types, as I said. And so, for example, to understand the US today, it really is a mix of democracy and empire. And you have, you know, you have, you know, this was ideal type, and so you may have kind of mixes. And in history, it's been like that. But the US is best characterized by being, you know, both an empire and a democracy. And so to the extent that democracy gets undermined in the US, its imperial tendencies will become really stronger, and we tend to see that. But to the extent that the US becomes more democratic, it will become less imperialist, but also more isolationist, more inward-looking. And the US has been like that in its very, very young history. So coming to empires, I would say that in the long run, empires are doomed. And why? Because, you know, empires, benefit from empires is by expanding, and the main reward from expansion was land, also natural resources, and slaves. Now, that's been like that for, you know, centuries, millennia, but in the modern world, the benefits from expansion are more limited. Human capital is the main driver of growth, and it cannot easily be forced to be productive. So if you invade a country, you try to force people to be productive, it's not going to work because you can't really force people to be at their maximum problem-solving capacity. And so, you know, the empires can only rely on their national human capital, but not on that of invaded territory. So the benefits of expansionism are kind of lower. In today's world, natural resources can be obtained via trade without the cost of maintaining and defended invaded territories. There's a whole literature about why colonialism failed, why, you know, the colonial system in general was replaced by the modern trade system. Of course, there are other reasons why empires are doomed, and there are actually quite a few papers on that. Another one that I want to mention is that the progress of education does lead to demands for human and civil rights and goods, albeit with different levels of intensity. Now, very quickly, what about nation states? The goal of ethnic homogeneity associated to nationalism in the nation-state project is completely illusory. If you look at human history, it has been a constant history of migrations. Empires were multi-ethnic, have always been like that. If you look today at successful large cities like New York or London, they're completely multi-ethnic. New York has the GDP of Indonesia, but 40% of people living in New York were not born in the US. There's a total ethnic mix, and you know that's the modern world. That's London. We don't have statistics on France, but that tends to be the modern world. Immigration, as we know, brings fresh labor force, new ideas, fruitful exchanges. Economic nationalism creates unnecessary inefficiencies and conflicts. What about democracies? I mentioned their problems, fragmentation and appeasement. So that's why I think it's very important for small, mid-sized democracies to build supranational institutions to regulate their relations on the basis of commonly accepted rules and threats from empires. And that, I think, seems to be the path of the future. And so democracies, because of their tendency to appeasement, need institutional solutions to their appeasement problem. And that is by creating multilateral commitment devices to defend each other. Now, I could talk for hours about just this last aspect, but that's really the direction we have to think about.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Over to you, Pascal.
Well, first, I think what we just heard from Professor Gérard in many ways helps understanding why this world is such a mess. I think my starting point would be, as usual, on things which I believe we agree on. The first one is that we need more international cooperation in a global world which will remain globalized. And second, that we are in a period where multilateralism as the main framework for international cooperation is in bad shape. So we have tension between the necessity to foster international cooperation and our institutional capacity to do it for basically two reasons. One, which we've known for some time, which is that this system, as long as it remains based on sovereignty, which is still the dominating principle of the institutional organization of governance on this planet, is inevitably limited. We should not expect from global governance or whatever shape of multilateralism the same sort of benefits as the one we expect from much smaller communities. And the second reason, which is more recent, which is that this multilateralism is under attack. It's under attack from Washington since Trump was elected, and it was under attack since the day Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and I'm only mentioning two of these main symptoms. We know, if we look at the way international cooperation has worked in, let's say, the last 50 years, there are two basic ways that have been used. The first one is the formal way, institutions, treaties, organizations, where sovereigns who interact between themselves with a category of Brahmins of this world, which are called diplomats, build disciplines, processes in which they accept to some extent and under some conditions to limit their sovereignty. And there's no way you cannot foster international cooperation without eroding the sovereignty of a country, which is its capacity to do whatever it wants to do. So that's the first one. For a variety of reasons, this road, for the moment, is not the right one. If you just want an example of that, is look at the UN Security Council, which is the epitome of institutionalized international cooperation and which is totally blocked. And the reason why it is totally blocked is because whereas the members of the UN Security Council who have a veto right should, in theory, not use it when they have a stake in the dispute which has been discussed, they do that all the time. So the official, formal, diplomatic, sovereign-driven part of international cooperation, for the moment, is not the way to go, and there are, as you know, lots of academic and political and think tank research on how the UN could work better, but the reality is that it doesn't work, and we've seen that in recent years. Then you have another road, which has always been used by non-state actors, which is the sort of informal capacity to cooperate internationally between multinational companies, NGOs, big cities, big non-national entities like regions, science people who have networks of international cooperation which sometimes have been incredibly resilient to problems on the geopolitical or geoeconomic side. If we look at, let's say, very, very simply, what has to be done in terms of international cooperation, it's about geopolitics or it's about geoeconomics, climate included. Let's have a very simple function of how it works. The first road is blocked by what I said about the institutions. The second one can help moving things forward on the geoeconomic and climate side. Any of us who has attended a COP in 15 years know very well that what has happened in what we call the green zone, which is where non-sovereigns interact, is often more important than what happened in the blue zone, which is where diplomats interact. So that's one. And then, of course, you have the capacity, I think, to move from what we call multilateralism to what I called, when we created the Paris Peace Forum in 2018, polylateralism. Let's again put things very simply. Multilateralism is between sovereigns. Polylateralism is between sovereigns and non-sovereigns whose habit, capacity, willingness to engage and take stakes in international cooperation are often much bigger than diplomats, who basically, and I said that once before being elected DG of the WTO, and I was very much criticized for having said that I know of a few diplomats who've been sacked for having said yes, and I know of no diplomat who's been sacked for having said no, which is something that is intrinsic to the official way of way. So back to polylateralism. What we've tried to move forward and evidence with a series things which have worked in a very wide variety of topics is this model of purpose-led, temporary, multi-stakeholder coalitions in order to get things done on a very specific issue, the cleaning of the low orbit of the Earth, or cooperation in order to properly deal with children on social networks, things on which you need a variety of actors to agree. And I would say that although what Professor Gérard told us would make us very pessimistic, given the structures he has outlined on the future of international cooperation, I think there may be a way there if you leave this notion that international arrangements are the monopoly of sovereigns. If you break this monopoly, then I think there may be a way to go.
Great. So we have maybe two views. Pascal, that you have maybe called the more optimistic view of Gérard, the more pessimistic, view of Gérard, and the new avenue that you propose. That sounds like, maybe we can call it optimistic. Now, let me bring Trump into the story. So neither of you, and rightly so, you have remained at some level of abstraction. But now let's come to today's reality and Trump. Now, let me start with what Gérard said. I mean, Gérard, what you were saying sort of sounded to me a bit like a new version of the end of history. That is, well, there are three possibilities. There are democracies, there are empires, there are nation states. Nation states, they are doomed. Empires, they are doomed. History goes in one direction. It's democracy. Democracy will win, and liberal democracy will win. And that is the end of history, and that, in a sense, is what we all believed. That happened after the end of the Cold War, the changes in the Soviet Union, the changes in China opening up, China joining the WTO. All of this was predicated on that view that history was going in one direction. And indeed, democracy wins. And you put it very well, I think, by saying, well, democracy wins, but it has some intrinsic weakness, right? And your intrinsic weakness was appeasement. Now, appeasement must be that there are some states out there, some entities that are not democratic, because if we were all democracies, why would I need to appease to anybody, right? It must be that others, they have not yet achieved the final stage of the end of history. They have not yet reached democracies. Or they've gone back, maybe like the Americans. Democracy gone back to empire. And maybe that's a little bit closer to the real world, that coexist democracies, of which you can say the EU is a very interesting form of democracy, because we are not an empire. We are post-empire and we are post-nation state. We are a democracy, right? We are a democracy built on a history that was imperial and nation state. And we saw where it led, and we have moved on. But others are at a different stage. If even we are going towards those stages, they are different stage. So the question is now we have Trump. And Trump is definitely, in terms of history, going back, right? We're all talking about either the 1930s or the 19th century, the great powers. So it's going back in history. So history doesn't seem to be going in one direction. History may be reverting. And so my question is, you know, in this discussion, appeasement, well, what is the solution to appeasement? Was multilateral institutions, sort of tying the hands of those that may abuse their power. But we see that Trump doesn't care, right? Doesn't, you know, there are rules, but I don't care about the rules. You know, make America great again, whatever the price. I don't care about any of those rules. The US has not paid its dues at the WTO for this year and for last year, and doesn't really care. So my question to both of you, what does Europe do in that world, that real world of Trump, of coexistence of democracy, of which the EU would be in the classification here a democracy, but there are others, and yet we share some common rules. We are all members of the WTO. The EU is a member of the WTO, China is a member of the WTO, and the US, we are all members of the WTO. So what does it mean for the EU, and what does it mean for the WTO or for multilateral institutions? That's my question to the both of you.
Should I answer first? Well, thank you very much. So, you know, many things that you said. You know, on one side you said I'm pessimistic, on the other side you said I'm advocating the end of history, so that's where everybody lives in a democratic world. But as I said, I think that to understand the US, to understand Trump, you have to see that the US is indeed what I would say a mix of an empire and a democracy. Now, what is going to happen to democracy in the US? I mean, it's clearly under attack. We don't know, you know, for how long. If democracy is indeed, you know, severely attacked in the US, then the US will simply become not only an empire like Russia and China, but it will become like a, you know, very rogue kind of empire. And there, I would say, in this confrontation between empires, China will win. China will win because the US right now, they're undermining the health system, they're undermining the university system, they're undermining the research, they're undermining, you know, openness to immigration. You know, I could go on and on and on and on. Now, at the same time, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. The US may recover from Trump, but there are going to be many long-run consequences. And so coming to the EU, which was what you were after, the trust is broken. The trust is broken, and you know, if the US goes back in the direction of democracy, it will be more isolationist. And so the EU that counted in a way on the military umbrella of the US cannot do that anymore. And so now we're in a very difficult situation, and that's why you saw, you know, all these European leaders, you know, going to Washington and trying to, you know, praise Trump, etc., because, you know, Ukraine is under attack, the EU is under attack. And coming back to this, just so that we understand this completely, we all know there is this wrong narrative that Putin has been pushing, that, oh, this was a defensive attack because NATO was going to, you know, this was, you know, basically NATO was the culprit, and it's NATO surrounding Russia. Actually, it's not NATO, it's the EU. And here we have to understand that, you know, we see, living in Brussels, you see all the problems with the EU, but what started everything in Ukraine was really the decision of President Yanukovych not to go ahead with the EU-Ukraine association agreement. The so-called coup of Maidan, which was basically the protests of the people that led to Yanukovych fleeing the country, this was because of the attraction of the EU. Now, in a way, the EU, you know, it's not really a democracy. The EU is a supranational institution, and as a supranational institution, it's probably the most successful in history. Sort of, WTO has not been as successful, but it's very, very successful, and so for us, it's kind of taken for granted. But if you're in Belarus, your dream would be that your country one day gets freed from Lukashenko and that they can go the direction of Ukraine. And that is exactly what is intolerable for Putin. That is why he attacked. And so for Putin, it's not just Ukraine that he wants. The EU is the enemy of Putin. And we're now in this situation. Many people understand that the EU is under threat. But we depend so much on the US, on intelligence, on air defense, on the technology, military technology, etc. And so we're living now in a critical moment where at the same time the US could be an ally in the future, I say an ally, but Europe, in a way, cannot depend on it anymore, and the trust is gone, so we have to do it alone. Now, this morning, there were discussions, should we have a European defense, etc. It's not 0-1. I'll stop here.
I would agree with most of what has just been said. Looking at what the EU should do, I think, has to start from something which is painful for us to recognize, and notably for my generation, which is that in the world of today, the EU is weak. We're not anymore what we used to call an economic giant. I remember economic giant, but political dwarf. No, we're not an economic giant anymore. We have a very low growth potential, and we are lagging behind in everything that counts for the economy of 20, 30, 50 years from now. So, on this ground, we are weak. On the geopolitical ground, we are even weaker. We were at a time successful in integrating geoeconomics, although the yields have very seriously diminished for the last 10 to 15 years, but we are very weak geopolitically, and the evidence of that is in the Turnberry deal, which is why, by the way, whereas there are two arguments on the side of the Commission to promote and defend this agreement, the one being stability and the second being security. Listening to the President of the Commission saying, no, this is not at all about security. This is just about a good trade deal about stability. Frankly, I'm sorry to say, doesn't make sense. The only solid, convincing reason for swallowing what we had to swallow in Turnberry is security, because of the necessity to keep the Americans supporting Ukraine. And anyone with a totally unpredictable Trump having taken the risk of saying we are decided to behave like enemies of the US in trade could have triggered such a reaction. So I'm not expanding on this, but when we know we need to do something, let's be clear on where we start from. The answer overall, and I will not detail this, of course, is autonomic strategy. Strategic autonomy is the way to go. There is a huge economic component in this, there is a huge trade component on this, and there is a huge defense, weapons, security component. Let's not expand on this. The other way to go, in my view, is to look at where we have comparative advantages in promoting international cooperation, human rights, development, climate, science, and try to rebuild via what Heather called at the beginning coalitions of the willing, where we have still an international credibility. We still have a combination of Commission capacity and member state capacity to develop such plans, we can put together strong diplomatic capacities by our member states in some areas and others in other areas. I think that's the way to go. I mean, moving in the direction, I wouldn't say of polylateralism in the sense I mentioned, but something which is more based on coalitions should, I think, be the priority, including on trade. The main criticism I have made in recent times against the way the Commission has handled its trade policy is that we really did not spend any serious effort to build a coalition of the willing, given what we knew Trump would do. Now, it's interesting to see that a few usual suspects, smaller countries, Singapore, Rwanda, New Zealand, Chile, are considering to build something like this. I mean, we should be the one spearheading such efforts of this kind.
This is a really interesting point that you make, Pascal, about that, Europe is not actually, at the moment, trying to create a coalition of the willing, at least on trade. It's doing its own deal with the US, which allows Trump to continue to do these bilateral deals and pit countries against each other, even if they have common interests and common concerns to maintain a rules-based trading system. And each of them, bit by bit, undermines parts of that system by agreeing to things from Trump which are not compatible with WTO rules, for example. So what should Europe do now, Gérard? You are a European academic who's been living and working in California for many years. You've seen the way that, for example, the governor of California has become a pole of opposition leadership against Trumpism. We don't see at the moment European leaders standing up and saying, very often, I stand for something completely different and opposed to Trump, and I'm going to lead an opposition to that. So if Europe were to create some kind of coalition of the willing, in what domain should that go? What would be really impressive to the United States? What would actually counter MAGA populism, the whole idea of that nation-first economics can work? What should Europe be playing to in terms of its comparative advantages seen from the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, first of all, I think we have to insist, and here I want to, support exactly what Pascal Lamy just said, that the reason Europe depends so much for its security on the US kind of, puts it in a position, to basically accept trade deals that are completely unfair, especially given the economic power of, so here I would say really, European defense is really the main preoccupation. And so again, Europe has to help Ukraine win. And that's really priority number one. I think that's really priority number one, to the extent that that can be possible. And we can talk about future European defense, etc. There are many possibilities here. I'm not going to look at it, but it's clear that given the behavior of kind of, what you could see is kind of a 21st century Monroe doctrine, which I would interpret in the imperialist sense, where the US would say, we have American continent, including Greenland. Russia can have Europe. We're not going to be in Europe. China can have Asia, and then we'll fight over Africa, unfortunately. So that's something we're looking at. And so mid-sized countries and democracies where you have the rule of law realize that they have to try to do something together. I was 2 weeks ago in Korea. They're in a worse situation because they completely depend on the US for military support, and at the same time they are kind of being entangled in economic dependence on China. And when you talk to them about say, well, you should do more to have an alliance with Japan, they say, oh yeah, but World War II, etc., etc. And here I think here this is where the EU in a way can play a role. When you think historically, after, nearly 100 years of 3 wars between France and Germany and all that, what has been created in Europe is great. And so in a way, there's a lesson to the world there that can be useful, certainly for Asia. And this is something we have to think about, because, Russia may collapse, may become weaker. China is going to be there for a while. And China has a clear understanding, and we've seen it now these last few days, has a clear understanding of how it wants to influence the world, not via invasions, but by a Confucian system of satellite states that will be economically dependent on them, and that should behave like good children behave towards their parents, as the Australians or the Lithuanians, etc., have seen. So that's the world China has in mind. And so we have to help other countries, be it Japan, South Korea, Australia, that are democracies, to kind of stand together in some way.
Pascal, I want to come back to one expression that you use and that we have used so many times today, and Gérard again, is the coalition of the willing. Just a very practical question. Some people talk about coalition of the willing. Other people sometimes use a slightly different expression, which is the like-minded countries. It's not exactly the same thing. Or it may not be exactly the same thing. They may overlap, but they may not overlap entirely. And there is one country that I want to pinpoint, China. In a sense, with the US, it's easy. The US is unwilling. Okay, so it's not. I don't. You have to pass at least the test of willing. If you're not willing, you can't be in the coalition. But maybe there is a second degree: is you need to be willing, and we have to want to join forces. That is the like-mindedness issue. So, do you think that the coalition of the willing is sufficient? In a sense, anybody who raises their hand and says, "I'm willing. Let's sit down and do this. I'm willing." Well, the EU, for instance, assuming that the EU may be one of the actors in constituting, in promoting, and you were saying, well, the EU has not done sufficiently. So that's sort of, the subtext was that the EU can do more, right? That's what you said. It still has, it's sort of maybe a bit of a declining power, but it has still a lot of soft power. And clearly the EU has a lot of soft power. So the EU can be encouraging this coalition. So should the EU said, look here, anybody willing to join me? I say, well, no, but there are those that I consider to be like-minded, and those should be part. The others, no. How do you deal with that? And in particular, how do you deal with China? And I will make it slightly harder, even by adding an element, by taking two of the issues that you raised as potential matters: climate and trade. On climate, it's clear that a coalition, I'm not going to call it the willing or like-minded, a coalition without China doesn't make any sense, right, to solve the problem. Because after all, we are doing those coalitions not just to sit in a room and be friends, but to solve a problem, right? So if China is not part of the solution, well, there's no solution. That's as simple as that. So China has to be certainly part of the coalition for climate. Is China also should it also be part of the coalition for trade? And then the question becomes, if you say no, if you say yes, that's easy. If you say no, do we have sort of variable geometry here, right? You have sometimes some country in one, is that good, is that bad? How do you see that?
Well, I'll answer your question, although I will side with my neighbor to say that for the moment, what matters most for the EU is danger, is the threats we are under. And as EU, we are under threat on Ukraine, which has to remain priority number one, which is why one may have some understanding for the Turnberry deal under this angle. I think there's a serious danger about democracy in the US, and I do not believe that if Trump would succeed in shrinking democracy in the US, this would not have an impact on us, given the political landscape we live in. I think there is a very serious debt threat and danger on the US side for the moment. So let's be conscious that we, for the moment, live under the pressure of these three main dangers. China. Of course, China has to be part of a coalition of the willing on climate. And by the way, if you look at the numbers, it seems that China and India are the only country on this planet who has reduced their carbon emissions last year, which says something about the speed at which China is moving in this direction. No doubt about that, in my view. And by the way, the Institut Jacques Delors in Berlin, in Brussels, is working on that. I'm going to discuss this afternoon with the Chinese ambassador to the EU. So there is a scope for cooperation, undoubtedly, because in a way we both have credibility and capacity to move. On trade, I would also say that China should be part of that, but this would entail some efforts on the side of China, which, by the way, may not be that much trade related as they are macroeconomic related. I don't believe the Chinese trade problems, as the problems they have in the world, are very much a trade problem. It's a problem of macroeconomic imbalance in China. And by the way, whereas I would cry wolf on climate, I am not crying wolf on trade, which may seem strange coming from me, but you have to look at the numbers. The US is 13% of world imports. Of course we have a problem with the US. And all those who trade substantially with the US have a problem. But the total of these problems is 13% of world trade. And by the way, if Trump succeeds in shrinking US trade imports, it's going to be 10% in a few years. So I do not rank this as a major issue. I think we need some sort of coalition of the willing on, let's say, let's keep trade open between ourselves. Let's not indulge in protectionism. Let's try and address one or two low-hanging fruit in reforming the WTO. And of course, China has to be part of that. But whereas I'm sure that China and India and EU are in the coalition for climate, I think EU and China could be in the coalition for a rules-based system. I'm not sure that at this stage India would. And I think on this we really have to factor in India in a way which we have not really done so well in recent times.
Thank you, Pascal. Very good. Okay, so we have 2 minutes for one question. Who's quick on the draw? Over here.
Stéphane Routier from HSBC. You mentioned the coalition of the willing, but in fact, what do you think about the EU joining the CPTPP, where you have Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the UK, Canada, all countries that are a coalition of the willing and with whom we might intensify our trade?
Okay, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Pascal?
One, I agree that the CTPP is, as a regional agreement, the best standard we have in the world, which is a bit of a paradox, by the way, because it was inspired and developed. The whole software of CTPPP is a US one, which, by the way, for us on services or intellectual property would probably raise a number of serious technical issues. But for us, looking at the CTPP is not really, in my view, the right direction. It's a rather shallow agreement as compared to what we do. For instance, if we succeed in ratifying the Mercosur, given the depth of trade openness, which is locked into these bilateral trade agreements. So while I agree that, for instance, if you look at environment, there are, in the CITPP, because of the US origin of that, interesting elements, I think it's a good model of reference. If it's like if you go and buy shoes. I mean, you like this sort of shoe, so you look in this direction, but in reality, it has to be something very different, including, for instance, for us on agriculture.
So thank you very much for that question, because it actually provided a very good example of a coalition of the willing, which Pascal has already just dissected as being something that's a shallow agreement that's not as good as things that the EU could do with other parts of the world. It's a very good illustration of the trade-offs in making coalitions of the willing. We used to worry about minilateralism and regional deals undermining multilateralism. Now we worry about even regional deals not really adding up to very much, as well as the multilateral system not being reinvigorated by them. So thank you very much for a fantastic discussion. We have certainly solved no problems, but we have at least a deeper understanding of them. And I hope that we might invite you back, Gérard, in a few years' time when you can tell us about the new policies of President Gavin Newsom and how Europe should make up for its past mistakes with the Trump administration. Okay, thank you. It's a coffee break now, and then please be back in half an hour.